afternoon and good evening to you all. My name is SLoCaT, and I am Research Director of the Partnership on Sustainable Low Carbon Transport. To welcome you to this webinar on lessons learned from COP21 for the transport sector. We'll focus on the implications for the transport sector from the recently adopted Paris Agreement in December 2015. During today's webinar, we first have a presentation by the Secretary General of the SLoCaT Partnership, Corny Huizinga, which will be followed by comments from three respondents who I will introduce in turn as they speak. You'll have a few minutes for clarification questions on these presentations, and I would like to ask you for just general questions until each of the respondents has spoken, and we will keep time at the end of the webinar for about 15 minutes of Q&A. I just want to do a few practical tips before we start the presentation. First and foremost, I would request that you please keep your microphones on mute during the presentation. So not muted your microphone, please do that now. Point, you have all selected Connect to Audio in order to connect to the sound for the webinar. Any questions throughout the webinar, I'd like you to use, please use the chat box and send to everyone. We'll choose from among these during the Q&A session. If you have any specific questions for me as the host, use a private message through the chat box selecting host. And I would also like you that we will be recording the session and we'll send the link at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I would like to leave the microphone to Corny and invite a presentation from Corny of about 20 minutes. So over to you, Corny.
This is Corny. I was just switching from my computer to my phone because I noticed that the connection was not optimal from China, so that's why the delay. I think that you can all see the presentation now. What I would like to do in the next 20 minutes is give you a brief flavor of what happened in Paris, especially from a transport sector perspective, and then talk a little bit about what the implications are of what happened in Paris for the transport sector in 2016 and beyond. And Carl had indicated after my presentation we will have Pierre Ghislain from the World Bank, Holger Daltman from Embark WRI, and Patrick Oliva from MCB, who will give their specific perspectives. We'd be happy to share the presentation that we are making tonight later with you. So first, briefly, like what is COP? I think that we have close to about 60 or 70 participants, but I expect that many of you were actually not in Paris. For those of you who were in Paris, I would like to ask you to indulge me. COP is a meeting which is held every year in order to follow up to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it is the event where people come together to finally decide on what we will be doing on climate change. A big thing, as you can see, like we had 196 countries in the COP in Paris, and there were about 40,000 people. So it was a very large event, and there are a number of multiple negotiations going on at the same time. We have people from government, but we also have a large number of NGOs and journalists typically in the COP. The COP in Paris is a special COP because there was the expectation that a new global agreement on climate change was going to be reached. The last major agreement on climate change was the Kyoto Protocol, which regulated for the first time the reduction of emissions. And this was in late 90s. There was an expectation about 7 years ago in Copenhagen that a new climate change agreement would be reached, but that's not successful. So the fact that we did manage it this time in Paris was actually a very significant event. The transport sector was well represented in Paris. The work on transport and the COP actually already started something 8-9 months before the COP. In March, a number of us met in Paris, and we decided to create what we called the Paris Process on Mobility and Climate. And the idea was that if we have a joint process which brings all the transport stakeholders together, we would probably have a larger impact in terms of visibility and probably impact on the negotiations. And so what we did in terms of preparations for Paris is that we developed a number of knowledge products, and they are available on the website of the PPMC. We talked about the INDCs, we talked about adaptation, but we also looked at what are the emission scenarios for transport so that we know what needs to be done. We also looked at financing. That what is important, that if all different transport organizations go to Paris to the COP, it's important to have a number of common messages. So we established a task force which was headed by Lucy Blythe from the World Bank and by Heather Allen on behalf of SLoCaT. And they pulled together a number of SLoCaT members and other organizations. And they're like, what is it that we want to communicate to the world in Paris? And the messages that we had were on decarbonization, they were on innovation within the transport sector, about adaptation, about urgency, about linkages with sustainable development and financing. So in Paris, we were physically present, that we had a large booth in the civil society area, which you can see the picture on the screen, and usually there were more people than what you see there. And we also had in the official part of the COP, we also had a booth as well. For those of you who were in Paris, you probably still all have your transport scarf, but we had about 5,000 of these scarves, and these scarves were actually very useful because it enabled us to start conversations with a large number of the people taking part in the COP. And that led to all kinds of interesting contacts. Also organized a number of events, and I think that a very significant event was the one on December the 3rd, which is called the Transport Focus. And this year, for the first part, the organizers of the COP decided to have a series of thematic events on the different sectors in the COP. This was under the banner of the LPAA, the Lima Paris Action Agenda. And SLoCaT and Michelin Challenge Bibendum, we're actually very proud that we were the only non-government, non-UN organization who were asked to one of these sectors. We also celebrated, and we had a very lively reception on the evening of December the 3rd. And then on December the 6th, we had Transport Day, which is typically the event where all the transport sector comes together. And this year had over 400 people in our event. So I mentioned the LPAA, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. Secretary Ban Ki-moon in September of 2014 decided to host a climate summit. He did that partly to encourage governments to become more ambitious, but he also did this to encourage the different sectors to take initiatives and to become more proactive in terms of commitments on climate change. Transport was one of the areas covered in the climate summit of the Secretary General, and 5 initiatives then. One on fuel economy, on railways, one on public transport, one freight, and more, which escapes me for the moment. Then, after the climate summit of the Secretary General, it was decided in Lima in December of 2014 to continue this process that the Secretary General had started. And they decided to create the Lima Paris Action Agenda. And the idea was to further ramp up the action by non-state actors on climate change. And that we are closely involved with the LPAA, with the Office of the Secretary General, with the French government and the Peruvian government. And that resulted that we had in December that there were 15 different transport initiatives covering all modes of transport in all major regions, which we could proudly present in Paris. I think that the significance of these 15 transport initiatives cannot be easily overestimated. And it's that we made an assessment and that we came to the conclusion that if all of these initiatives would be implemented at scale, our estimation was that at least 50% of all the passenger and freight trips in 2025 would be affected. So, potentially, there is a very large impact, and it sent out a very powerful message to the negotiators that the transport sector was actually not waiting for an agreement, but the transport sector was actually proactive, take steps already. We came to, let's come to the major surprise of Paris. So people call it the Paris Agreement, but I think that you could also call it the Paris Surprise. That skeptical before the conference took place whether 195 governments would actually be able to reach an agreement. And generally, the feeling was that if there would be an agreement, that this would not be a very strong agreement. So also, I think that amongst the participants who were in Paris, that in the second week, when news started to get out, that we had a high ambition coalition being established between Europe and the African countries, that a lot of the people still felt that this would not necessarily really change the course of the negotiations. And interesting to see that this high ambition coalition was starting to gain more support, and that it became a serious possibility that would have a climate change agreement, which actually would say that we should limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The scenario has, for a long time, guided the discussions on climate change, and these efforts, which started by the Marshall Islands of 1.5 degrees, it was actually quite a surprise. And you'd say that, for example, for the transport sector, there was nobody who had actually modeled what we would have to do in order to meet this 1.5 degree target. And that all of the efforts in the transport sector, including those by SLoCaT, had been focused on the 2 degree scenario. It was literally overnight that we had to ask our number cruncher to come up with an assessment what the 1.5 degree scenario would mean for transport. So all in all, I think that this one of the few times that international negotiators really surprised the people, the sectors, the NGO activists, etc., with coming up with a more ambitious target than what was anticipated. So if you hear, so the target speaks about which should go to well below 2 degrees and possibly to the 1.5 degrees. So now that what is the business as usual scenario is that emissions are going to go up. And you can see that on this slide, what we have done is we have mapped both the emissions economy-wide, but also indicate the transport emissions, and that you see that while that Europe and North America are relatively modest in terms of the growth, that that we see that the growth in some of the other parts of the world is considerable. The other thing that you can see here is that the expected business as usual growth of emissions in the transport sector is actually higher than it is economy-wide. So that makes the transport sector an important sector if we talk about such an ambitious agreement. It is clear that transport, which currently is about a quarter of all the energy-related emissions and about 14% of the total emissions, is an important contributor to greenhouse gases. We also know that emissions are growing, and we see that at the moment already in 45% of the countries that transport is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions of the energy-related emissions, and that in pretty much all of the other countries that it is the second largest. So it is really so transport is really a key sector when it comes to the 2 degree and the 1.5 degree scenario. Next slide. What we have done is that we have plotted the emissions of the various parts of the world and of bunker emissions. And what we have done is we have plotted them for historic emissions, for business as usual 2 degree, and an estimated 1.5 degree scenario. And this is based on computations from the International Energy Agency, the World Energy Outlook, and the UNEP emission gap report. And see here that what does it mean if we talk about a 2 degree scenario or a 1.5 degree scenario? It means that by 2035, that we will have to reduce the emissions if we compare it to a 2 degree scenario by 33%, and it would compare it to a 1.5 degree scenario that in 2035, say in 20 years from now, that we would have to be 55% below business as usual. If we look a bit further to 2050, which currently has not been assessed very well, that our estimate at this moment is that we have to reduce 80%. So what becomes clear that at a global level that we have very ambitious challenges in the transport sector. It also means that you no longer just say like that we do step-by-step changes, but it really drives the message home that we need to have transformative, disruptive change in the transport sector. It also means that this brings an end to discussions whether we should focus on technology measures or whether we should focus on behavioral measures. And it is very much clear that we will need all of this, and we will need still additional actions as well. Looking at it, so far we have been speaking about a global scenario, but it's important to realize that there are considerable differences between the different parts of the world. And what we have done in this graph is that we have looked at the regional implications of the 2 degree and the 1.5 degree scenario. And it's interesting to see that if you talk about the 2 degree scenario, that pretty much all parts of the world, especially the developing part of the world, can still grow their emissions. But if we would move to a 1.5 degree scenario, then we see that pretty much all parts of the world, with the exception of non-OECD Asia, that they would have to reduce their emissions compared to 2010. This is in a context where we still expect to see very large increases in mobility, especially in the developing world. Because I think that probably some of you know the numbers that if we talk currently about vehicle ownership in the US, we talk about 750 vehicles per thousand. But if we talk about countries like China and India, we are respectively at about 100, or we are at about 70 vehicles. So it's important to further elaborate these scenarios. I think that one of the things that the SLoCaT partnership is going to work on, to develop this narrative for the 1.5 degree scenario. What is it that we have to do? And we are very much encouraged to see several of the members of the SLoCaT partnership, like the International Transport Forum, International Energy Agency, the Global Fuel Economy Initiative, ITDP, etc., have already announced that they are going to start modeling exercises and scenario building exercises to translate this 1.5 degree scenario. And I think that this is going to be one of the big tasks for the transport sector in 2016. I think that now let's move a little bit to the actions that countries need to take. So before the COP, we had all the countries in the world were going to submit. They submitted what they called internationally determined contributions, and this is an overview of what the kind of actions are that need to be that they would be taking. So people have been measuring this, and they say, like, what are the impacts? And we see that while countries agreed on a 2 degree scenario and moving to 1.5, that the policy commitments that they delivered in Paris actually on average ended up on 2.7 So there is a clear gap between policy and ambition. We're happy to see that transport was well represented in these intended nationally determined contributions, and that we saw that 77% of the INDCs call for mitigation action on transport, 10% had a transport emission reduction target, and that 61% of the INDCs proposed specific measures. We saw the measures proposed were still had a large focus on technological issues, on what we call avoid, shift, improve on the improve part. We saw that there was a bias towards urban transport. All, one could say that mitigation ambition in the INDCs fell far short of the degree scenario, let alone the 1.5. So in terms of what can the transport sector do after Paris? So in Paris, there was a Paris Agreement, and there was another document, which is the COP21 decision. What we have done on this slide is that we have indicated a number of references to the Paris Agreement, where we think that as a transport sector that we have an opportunity, but that there's also need that the transport sector becomes involved. So just to mention a few of those, we need to further work on the INDCs. These INDCs, which become effective in 2020, it would be helpful if the ambition level would be scaled up. We need to communicate in a better and a clearer way what the mitigation and the adaptation capacity of the transport sector, so that the governments become more familiar with that and that they are incorporating this in their policies. We're very happy to see that the Paris Agreement had quite a large focus on adaptation, and this is something where the transport sector has stayed behind. We need to look at finance, we need to look at technology, we need to look at capacity building, and then where it says the bullet MRV in support of global stocktake implementation and compliance. This is key because ultimately what people said in Paris as well, it's good to have an agreement, it's good to agree on 2 degrees and moving to 1.5, but if there is no monitoring, if there is no verification, it's not going to happen. And it's clear that this needs to be happening in all the sectors, including the transport sector. Then we need to make certain that we take action not just after 2020, but also before 2020. And need to take up the opportunity which is provided by the Paris Agreement for a much stronger involvement of non-party stakeholders in the climate change policy process. The next here you can see that that there are a number of meetings planned in 2016. We feel which together you could say form a roadmap which we can use to advance the discussion on the role of transport in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. This will off with a discussion of a stakeholder meeting of the continued Paris process on mobility and climate in Paris. That there is going to be a big stop is in Washington for the Climate Action Summit, and I think that Pierre will say a little bit more about it. We have ITF in Leipzig, and there are a number of other meetings. And I just wanted to focus very briefly the attention on the last one, which is the Secretary General's Global Conference on Sustainable Transport. The expectation is that in November or December, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, for the first time in history, will convene a global conference on sustainable transport. And we feel that that is a good opportunity to really pull together all the work on both on transport and climate change, but also on transport and sustainable development. And we have a large conference in Ecuador in October, Habitat 3, which is about urban issues. So the key points, the way forward, that the transport sector needs to get familiar and needs to develop a consensus around the concept of zero net emissions by 2050. We need to look at more ambitious pre-2020 action and scaled up first generation INDCs. Technology is important, but we feel that that institutions and finance are probably as important, if not more important. It's also clear that the stakeholders in the transport sector will have to change in a transformative manner if we really talk about the large-scale changes that are required in order to meet the 2-degree and the 1.5-degree scenario. It's clear that improved coordination is required between state and non-state actors. We are very happy to see that the Paris Agreement actively encourages this. We see it as the last point that the political momentum currently is with climate change, but at the same time we feel that action on sustainable development will actually determine the success of climate action on transport. And this goes back to the argument that in many cases that changes in the transport sector are not taken for a climate reason, but that they are taken for other reasons like congestion, like air pollution, etc. So all in all, we feel 2016 offers us an opportunity, but also a responsibility. Like the transport sector has the responsibility to come up with a pathway which will enable its contribution to this ambitious target that the political decision makers agreed upon in Paris. Over to you, Carl.
Thank you very much, Corny, for this presentation and for laying out both the opportunities and abilities coming, I should say, for the transport sector coming out of this agreement. So, to bringing on our three respondents, but just before we do that, I should just make a few minutes if there are any specifically clarifying questions for Corny on this presentation. You're welcome to put those, type those into the chat box. Please address to everyone. Take at most 2 or 3 clarifying questions again, and you can save more substantive questions for discussion again following the 3 respondents. So give me a moment to put those together, and in the meantime, I will ask Mr. Pierre Gislin to prepare for his responses to Corny's presentation. Questions? With that, of course, you can you save those questions for later, and certainly you can keep them rolling as our respondents speak. So with that, I would really Pleased to introduce our first respondents, as mentioned, Mr. Pierre Ghislain, Director for Transport and ICT Global Practice at the World Bank. So over to you, please, Pierre.
A really remarkable job they did with other PPMC partners, of course, in Paris. And it was quite well received. It was a very strong presence of the transport community in the climate change discussions, and it showed a strong kind of multi-stakeholder partnership at work and effectively at work. So really thanks and congrats on that. So I'll just make some points following up on Corny's presentation. I agree with everything that Corny, so I won't be challenging here. First, maybe a word on the Climate Action Summit, May 5 and 6 in Washington, D.C. The World Bank has been asked to coordinate the transport track of this summit. There's 6 different tracks like cities and energy, etc. And we've been asked to coordinate the transport track. It's going to be a much smaller summit, nothing like the 40,000 people at COP21, like 500, 600, 700 people total coming to Washington, D.C. to really focus on implementing the Paris agreements in these different areas. So it's going to be very much focused on the multi-party stakeholder and much on the non-state stakeholders, because it will follow only by 2 weeks the high-level signing of the Paris Agreement in New York I think on April 22nd. So very much focused on implementation. The way we are planning to organize this track is very much jointly with PPMC, with ITF, WRI, and other core stakeholders who have been involved so far. I think it's important to see this summit as just one step on a longer road, and I like your chart there showing this road and the multiple meeting points along it. So focus very much on implementing what does it mean, who should do what, and in what framework. So from a World Bank point of view, clearly we are country-focused and we are implementation-focused. So one of our main areas of emphasis in the post-Paris period is going to be to work with our client governments on how to implement and make more specific the various commitments they have made in their NDCs. So that's going to be our priority. For example, in India, we had the Minister of Railways with us last week in Washington, and a discussion was how do we kind of move more freight in particular, but also more passengers from roads to rail. We're also doing some significant work on waterways in India, again, same purpose. In Brazil, significant work on urban mobility, including metros, etc. So different ways to work with partners at country level to implement these NDCs and make them a reality. One of the key things, of course, is significant vested interest, and one will need champions in these countries to make that happen. And that, again, the multi-stakeholder aspect here is absolutely critical to generate reform energy. Next point is really these NDCs are going to be critical because action is at national and local level. And so we need to think a bit more about how the 15 global initiatives that transport has sponsored the LPAA, how they're going to interact and support these NDCs. And so in Paris, one of the events that was organized by PPMC saw, for example, the Prime Minister of Aruba showing interest in working on electric cars with the initiative that covers that topic. So this was a nice match, but I think there are more that can be made. One of the issues, of course, is that many of the initiatives are kind of, in a sense, narrower than the way most governments would pursue their NDC. So we need to find a good way to make initiatives relevant at country level, not in all countries of the world, of course, but having some way to do that. Next point is, again, a bit related to the previous one now, is it will be very important to have a framework for joint tracking and implementation of these initiatives and of the NDC. So having a bit of a results framework that people can, with a common vision, common objectives, a bit like our energy colleagues did under Sustainable Energy for All, having something like that that can provide an overarching framework against which NDCs and global initiatives can be measured. So my next point, and sorry for going so fast through it, but we don't have much time, is climate finance. Transport has had very limited access to the global climate financing funds and initiatives, and so one of our priorities moving forward has to be how do we improve that, how do we change that, and there's a set of opportunities. The Green Climate Fund is keen to fund some transport projects. The Climate Investment Funds are also willing to consider a special transport window. One of the key things when it comes to financing and really the concessional financing of the externalities associated with climate change and transport is to what extent we can use the co-benefits that many of these measures will generate as part of the equation to justify some of the concessional financing. Then a number of more specific things I think we need to do, and again, I'm very much focused on the implementation. How do we get countries to get on and implement what they have committed or go beyond what they have committed? I think we need some probably clear kind of a list of do's and don'ts, some simple checklists, like what we have on road safety in terms of what a good legislation looks like. We may need this in a number of areas to make it a bit easier and more easily communicated and shared with clients and stakeholders in particular in developing countries. And for example, Corny, you mentioned these the various parties that were working on modeling exercise, etc. Also finding a way to have tools that allow national stakeholders to model various initiatives, so that not only at global level, but also have tools available that allow governments and stakeholders at national level to see what different reforms might do in terms of impact on climate change. So that's it from my side, and thanks for organizing this. Back on you, Carl.
Here, appreciate you putting out the need to expand access for beyond climate finance and to create, as you mentioned, assistance for national stakeholders as well as at the global level. So very much appreciated. With that, move along and introduce our second respondent, board member, Mr. Holger Dalkman. He is Director of Global Policy and the Director of Embark at the WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. Please, Holger.
Thank you, Carl, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Here from Washington, D.C., and we're close to getting a historic snowstorm here. So after the historic event in Paris, we might see also an historic event today in D.C. So first, congratulations to Corny and the entire initiative. I must say I'm a very proud board member of SLoCaT, and I think we really raise the momentum of transport in Paris. I'd like to focus my comments more on what needs to happen next and what is about what we can do in 2016. First of all, I think what Corny clearly showed was, in fact, we have achieved a lot. We gained the momentum in Paris, but in the transport sector, we're moving probably more on a transition towards an incremental change, and what we really need is a disruptive change. Before, already with the 2 degrees, this is a major challenge, but now going even further to 1.5. So building on what Connie said about the scenarios, diving a little little bit deeper. Take one example, the International Energy Agency highlighted in their scenario last year for the 2-degree scenario, need to have a strong modal shift. And as part of that, they said we need 25,000 kilometers of BRT by 2050. So far globally, according also to our work in the BRT Center of Excellence, we have 5,300. And in the last 10 years on average, we added 210 kilometers BRT lines globally. If we want to achieve this 25,000, we need to also go to an annual 500 kilometers. So this is just one example to break down, saying this is the scale we're talking about if we're really serious about that. So in terms of integrated system and BRT, it would mean really to more than double, to bring new systems, to expand, and particularly to improve. Second comment is really how we can build that momentum, and building on what Connie said and what Pierre said. Climate is important for transport, but the main driver is really we need to have access for all and sustainable mobility for all. And here, I think there's a great opportunity to bring the Sustainable Development Goals and the NDCs together in the future. For example, we have an SDG target, halving the road fatalities out of road accidents by half, 600,000. So from 1.2 million. So how we achieve that? At the same time, also we want to have achieving also the climate target. So bringing together a vision zero for safety, together with a vision zero for carbon. Secondly, NDCs. Connie pointed rightly, 61% have already a roadmap for transport. That means there is a 39 haven't got that. So to add that. Secondly, we need to improve these roadmaps. They're not sufficient, so countries need to take far more action. And we need also to enable that. And it showed in the slide Connie showed us on the INDCs produced by WI clear, so we are more on the 2.7 degree scenario. The third issue is around the LPAA, so all the initiatives. It's there, but we can use 2016 to strengthen them. How to really enable the increase in modal share, like now. How to enable mobilize your cities, another initiative, which is that we need 100 mobility plans. But currently we have in the NDCs only 7 countries saying, oh, mobility plans are important. So how these two is coming together, the NDCs and the LPAA, and make that also a far larger, bring that to a far larger impact. And third, I think we can't risk so that we are now proud that the transport sector is achieving a lot by not looking to the left and the right. A lot of things happen in Paris also on cities. The announcement of the Compact of Mayors, more than 400 mayors came together saying, we want to set target on carbon. We agree on reporting, measuring and reporting, and we take actions. And 400 cities came there and saying, we take actions. So bringing what is called as the Compact of Mayors, and I did research around the potential where we came up with the current potential 9 gigatons by 2030 in these cities alone. So therefore, and transport, as we know, is a key part of city solutions. So how do we bring together the Compact of Mayors, the movement there together, so with the transport sector? And I think we have a great opportunity, particularly here in May in Washington, D.C. Pierre mentioned the Climate Summit, to bring also these initiatives together. Finally, on finance, to share here that there is an initiative called the City Climate Finance Leadership Alliance. Again, also something which is not just on transport, but how can we leverage here existing initiatives who have the aim to really take out barriers, enable better investment also in cities and therefore also for urban transportation. So I'm closing here that I think with the events Connie highlighted, bringing the narrative better together, bringing really also building a stronger movement, I think is a great opportunity for us in 2016, where we can come from the global commitments to local actions. And again, thanks to everybody joining today, because I think it's important that we all work on this together. Thank you.
Thanks to Holger for your many comments, and in particular for pointing out the need for disruptive change, not just incremental change within the transport sector in order to meet the 1.5 degree scenario. And thank you as well for highlighting the important role of cities setting the bar high for accelerating these actions in the transport sector. Finally, I would like to introduce our last respondent. And SLoCaT, I should mention, SLoCaT's very close partner within the Paris process for mobility and climate. This is Patrick Oliva, Senior Vice President in charge of strategic anticipation and sustainable development within the Michelin Group for Michelin Challenge Bibendum. So I would like to welcome Patrick to present his comments as well.
Hello, Charles. Thank you for a great presentation, and thank you for inviting me to be a respondent in this webinar. And let me first indicate how pleased I was to participate in this PPMC adventure, which led to, I think, interesting results that we're going to use in 2016. And I'd like to add that I really and wholeheartedly concur with what has been said so far. I think most of the points have been covered. So I will, for this, not repeating what has been said, I'd like to focus on just a few complementary points. First of all, the takeoff from COP21 is a clear reinforcement of the convictions that we already had, that there are three priorities in really improving the state of transport in the world. One is very much about urban mobility. There's a lot to do, and as you know, the importance of cities is increasing. Just like Holger said, we are blessed by the fact that the mayors are really convinced of the role that they can play. Very important. That's priority number one. A lot can be done in the context of innovation, of course, and city. I would say cities in general present a very favorable area in which to introduce innovation and deploy it to the right scale. The second priority is about, and it's that green freight is an absolute necessity. One thing, this is something that we need to concentrate about, not only from a private sector perspective, but I think a lot of players have got to be involved in that. That's very important. The third priority is about passenger car and light trucks, where it is clear that we need to make sure that we make very substantial progress in the years to come. As part of this priority, it's clear that the electromobility declaration, the e-mobility statement, which was issued in Paris at the time of the COP21, this statement is very important. A lot of companies, a lot of institutions have already decided to join, and to support this statement, it has to become a reality. So we should not forget these three priorities, and coming back to the point that was already mentioned of pushing, developing, boosting some of the initiatives, the Fin initiative which were presented at COP21, we certainly need to make sure that those which are connected or mostly connected to these three priorities really receive great attention, and this is quite doable. The second point I'd like maybe to put a little emphasis on is this necessity. We've been very much talking about transport, and the way we need to look at things in the future is certainly to have in mind an extended vision of transport. In other words, transport is not only about the mode that we're used to with the vehicle manufacturers, the train operations, and so forth. It's more and more about seeing a very strong connection with the energy transformation that the world has got to undergo. And transformation is very important, so we have to look at transport energy as being very, very closely connected. And when we look at what really becoming important for the world in the years to come is the context of mobility, in which new players are coming. A lot of players are coming, including the ICT world, the information communication technology world, that is interested, which is already playing a great role that we need to recognize. Certainly more, and big companies like IBM, SAP, and the newcomers like Google, like Uber, and so forth, who provide this service orientation. Very important. It's very much of the connection between technologies and behaviors, and it's very clear that in this respect, this extended vision of mobility has got to be supported by the right set of new policies to make sure that these innovations can be developed to the fullest extent. And I think that one of our joint work in 2016 is certainly to make sure that this happens and that we all together come to this understanding that it's expanding world. And transport, this is one of the great successes also in coming from COP21. Transport has become a full-fledged sector that the private and the public world now consider as absolutely key, not only in finding solutions to climate change, but also in transforming the society. So it's very good for all of us, but it puts also some intensity on what we have to do. The third point I would like to mention also is to reemphasize the fact that the international agenda in 2016 is particularly helpful in that respect, with a lot of international events being already planned. I think there is a necessity to connect all these events. This is something that, together with SLoCaT, we very much have in mind. Starting in Amsterdam with this informal council on transport, energy, and environment in April already, as a preparation for Washington. This is the way I tend to look at it. So we have a wonderful opportunity, and I really would like to make sure we have already started to work with the private sector. You know that the Mission Challenge Momentum is a coalition of, to start with, a coalition of private companies involved in the mobility sector. We have already been in contact, and we have the joint objective of coming up by the end of 2016 with what we call a macro vision of what a pathway towards a modern, sustainable, and decarbonized mobility could look like. So we have a fabulous opportunity there to move from one milestone event to another one, and by so doing to really progress towards something which might be developed as a macro roadmap with the support from the entire mobility ecosystem. So I think that this is very important, and in particular in Washington, this is an important milestone, and thank you Pierre, to take lead in organizing this track, as you said. You can count on our support, and we definitely count on you. It's very important that this worldwide event, the whole event, very much focused on making sure that we bring the private sector very much on board. In some areas, the private sector is there. In some of the areas, it has to show more resolve in addressing the very ambitious objectives that have been set, in particular with the 2°C objective and possibly the 1.5 ambition. So that's very clear. And of course, we've seen in COP21 the diversity of expectations from the developing world. So once again, we need to ensure that we find ways of organizing somehow the priorities which have got to be addressed in order to move forward as efficiently and as rapidly as possible, because there is a sense of urgency that we need to take into consideration. Okay, this is basically what I wanted to say, because a lot has already been said and a lot of very interesting things. So I'm closing here, and back to you, Carl.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thanks for emphasizing the important role of the private sector in driving innovation and in looking at new ways, new forms of mobility regarding passenger cars and transport energy as we look ahead to the 2016 agenda. So I'd also like to thank all speakers once again for your very informative responses. With that, we are 5 minutes from I'm in my part of the world, but to get the webinar, though, I'd like to again just a bit. We have some nice questions lined up, and I'd like to pose several of those questions together to our presenters, so we'll have a chance to give responses. So again, I'd be happy to extend the webinar for 5 minutes so we can get these questions in. Let's start with the first question, a general question on the presentation. This is focused on how central win-win solutions will be, what wider benefits or disbenefits of the forthcoming sustainable transport in the context of COP21. So get that as question number one. Second is to focus a bit on what's happening within mobility. Obviously, there are many ongoing initiatives that we're quite aware of, lowering speed limits, implement bus rapid transit, and so on, as mentioned by Holger, but how can these be better communicated and better evaluated, as mentioned by Corny in the course of his presentation? Let me throw in one more and then pause and let the presenters respond. Third question I'd like to address is how to engage other sectors to make transportation policies more coherent, specifically looking at fossil subsidy reform, changing incentives for private cars, and related incentives on that in that area. So with that, I would open the floor to the presenters and look forward to hearing your responses.
And thank you to Pierre, Patrick, and Holger for their very welcome additions to what I mentioned in my presentation. I think taking Morten's first question, where he talks about the win-win, I think that one of the things that became clear, I think also from some of the remarks of the others, is that we're talking about reducing emissions from a sector which is still growing. And we know that the transport sector needs to grow, because I think that if we talk about a win-win situation and linking this to sustainable development, I think that Pierre also mentioned the concept of access. Still have, for example, in the rural areas, we still have 1 billion people who currently do not have access to an all-weather road. So there is a lot of pent-up demand there for additional mobility. That in large parts of the developing world, that people are still walking or cycling, and they are not doing that, say, just out of choice, but they are doing this because they currently have no other choice. So it is clear that we need to come up with solutions which take into account that there is going to be a further growth in transport. So the win-win, I think, should also apply to improving mobility, improving access, but we should do this in a more clever way, and we should do this in a cleaner way. We should do this in a safer way, like Holger referred to the 1.2 million people who currently die each year because of accidents. And I think that this was also, I think that it goes back to the last point that I mentioned in my presentation, is that while the political momentum might be with climate change at the moment, that ultimately the solutions from the transport sector need to include sustainable development as a driver. And I think that also links then to what I think that what Carl mentioned with the last question. Like it's clear that we are not going to have these win-win solutions if we are not able to broaden our discussions to other sectors. If we are not bringing on board the health sector, if we're not bringing on board the energy sector, like we can talk about electric mobility, but if we don't have the clean power, we will not have the climate impacts. So I think that Morten had put external issues between quotation marks, and I think that this is a very key thing, and I think that this is one of the examples of disruptive thinking that we need. Economic evaluation of transport is currently not including these so-called wider benefits or disbenefits. So I think that unless we have a standard new methodology which actually brings these things on board in the evaluation of policies, programs, and projects, it is going to be difficult. So let's stop here so that I leave some time for the other respondents as well. So back to you.
And I think, again, maybe I'll take the respondents in order to respond to these questions collectively. So I'd like to pass the mic to Pierre if you have some comments on these specific questions.
Yeah, thanks. So both these questions and some of the earlier remarks point out the importance of not only deepening our transport actions and coordinating them internally within the transport sector, but also linking up strongly with other key sectors. And energy has been mentioned, cities and urban, ICT. So extremely important. The impact is only going to work if these things come together. Two, on the fossil fuel side, clearly we stand very strongly behind the need to introduce carbon pricing. That may not happen globally immediately, but we need to strive towards that and support various schemes that are already taking place. We also need to ensure that fossil fuel subsidies are phased out and that the transport sector reflect properly externalities the way it is taxed and in the way the various modes of transport are taxed. And again, this is not the case in many countries today. There's so a lot of work needed on pricing, subsidy, and taxation. Thanks.
Very much, Pierre. And again, I'd like to work in order here, so I will pass it on to Holger to respond to some of the questions posed by the audience as well.
Sure. Thanks, Carl. Two brief responses. One, in terms of the good practice, as well as the question on how to bring the different sector narratives together. I think what we need is a stronger message from the transport sector and bring the narrative together. So, for example, here, the New Climate Economy, a global initiative in the last 2 years, managed really to change the discourse and highlighting here that climate and economy actually coming together. And part of that report was also work on cities, saying if we are compact, connected, and coordinated, we can actually save $17 trillion by 2050. So I think it's important also to bring the narrative better together. There are different options this year. One is the high-level panel on sustainable transportation will come up also with an outlook report, and this is an opportunity for everybody to engage and bring that narrative together. The second on entry points and also in terms of accountability, I think we have a great opportunity with the Sustainable Development Goals to break them down on the national as well as on the local level, and saying what are the core indicators to really have a clear measurement on the impacts and solutions around urban development and urban mobility. And here, then particular to see what are the entry points in the different countries and taking air pollution as one example. We just learned from Beijing in the Congress there saying we need also to change our city cause of air pollution and taking action, particularly on urban mobility. So I think it's also important to see what are the specific entry points in different countries which enable then more holistic solutions towards urban mobility.
Thank you very much, Holger, for these comments. And as I see the mic to Patrick for some final comments on these audience questions, I wanted a few questions that have come to the queue as well. Sort of reading an earlier question, when we talk about disruptive change, are disruptive actions, are they moving disruptively in the right directions? How do recent and trade agreements potentially influence disruptive change, and by the same token, how the climate actions being undertaken by the transport sector likely to be affected or undermined by the decline in oil prices? So I will toss that in mix as I pass the mic to Patrick once again.
Thank you. I'd like to echo what was said, in particular by Holger, reinforcing the benefit of the real win-win things in terms of improving the climate change situation and improving the economy. I think that one of the takeaway from COP21 was a clear expression by the private sector in particular that there was no economic chaos in sight, eager to move away from fossil fuels. That's extremely important to keep that in mind. And it's absolutely clear that the key to growth is always the same in all countries, is investment in innovation for a growing population. If you have these three ingredients of involve investment, so that requires financing and funding, investment in innovation, and what we're talking about is really developing innovation for a growing population. That's the case globally. That's also the case in cities where we see most of the innovation should come from. So it's very, very important. Second important thing is that to look at freight, which is very important actually in the sector perception of how to move about climate change. It's very clear that in this growing area, because freight is increasing and so are attached emissions. It's very clear that we will never get to the right improvement in the situation if we don't reanalyze, redesign the entire supply chain systems. We have to shorten the supply chains. Not only do we have to improve the different transport modes, to improve vehicles, and so that will do a lot of good, but it will not be enough. We really have to look at how to shorten supply chains in a very fragmented way of having established industry in particular so far. There is a lot to gain and so on. This is doable. This requires a lot of thinking, of course, but at the same time, in terms of saving time, in terms of saving money, it might create a real disruption, and for the better. I insist very much, very important. And I'd like to finish by saying we mentioned economic growth, which is important. We mentioned health, that's very, very important. Let's not forget about the mere pleasure of people. I think that living clean, healthier cities, enjoying the possibility of moving around or of moving goods more rapidly, more efficiently, and in a way which avoids unnecessary or unwanted transport, the time saving which is attached to that can create a real plus. So I said this climate change issue is a real driver. It's not a constraint. We have to really look at it as an opportunity, as a way of really facilitating transitions that we know have to be reduced, even if this question of climate change had not evolved. But it's very clear that from a global economic and human perspective, there were things which had to change. So climate change, that respect, is certainly the driver. Let's make sure that we use it to the fullest extent. Closing here.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Patrick. Thanks to all of the respondents and for questions and for again reminding us to end on the positive note, not only of the responsibilities but also the opportunities of climate change is presenting within the transport sector, and once again the opportunities for making progress in this area under the Paris Agreement. That, I think our time is drawing to a close. I'd like to once again thank all of our presenters. I'd like to thank all the participants on the line for your interest, for your questions. We are, and at the beginning of this webinar, are recording the webinar, so we will certainly make this available to each of you and post it on the SLoCaT website. And with that, I would like to thank you once again, and we look forward to your participation in forthcoming webinars of the SLoCaT partnership. So once again, and thank you to you all, and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you to all of you.
Thanks. Bye.